I'm Mike Evans, Head of Corporate Heritage for the Rolls-Royce Company and Chairman of the Rolls-Royce Heritage Trust. Well, Rolls and Royce met on the 4th of May 1904, and the day they first met, decided that they would work together and that Royce Limited would make a range of motor cars sold exclusively by CS Rolls & Co in London, and they'd call them Rolls-Royce cars. Great success that was, and so 2 years on in March 1906, Rolls-Royce Limited was formed as a company, and in its Articles of Association, first paragraph, it says that the company has been formed with a lot of extra words thrown in, but the nub of it was for to make motor vehicles for use on land, on water, or in the air. So Rolls-Royce was formed on day one with a vision of being in aviation in the longer term. Now, that was March 1906. In December of that year, Charlie Rolls, who was a pioneer aviator, went over to New York to establish our first overseas activity with the Rolls-Royce Import Company on Broadway, and he timed that to make sure that he made his first contact with Wilbur and Orville Wright. And so from day one, Rolls-Royce had an involvement, an interest in aviation, but nothing actually happened in terms of getting involved in making things seriously for aeronautical purposes, other than a bit of consultancy to the British War Office's first dirigible balloon, where Henry Royce was the consultant engineer in 1909, until war broke out in 1914. And within days of the outbreak of war, Henry Royce began the design of his first aero engine, the Eagle, of which we have an example here. And the Eagle used all the technology of the most successful car we'd done that far, which is the famous Silver Ghost, to create the bottom end of the engine, plus some advanced technology at the upper end of the engine on things like the breathing of the cylinders and camshafts and so on. And during the course of the First World War, thousands of Eagle engines and their smaller brother, the Falcon, served on the Allied side. And I think over half the total Allied horsepower used in the air during the First World War, from 1914 to 1918, came from engines of Rolls-Royce design.
In World War I, somebody told me one of the reasons that one of the things that Henry Royce wanted was to make an engine that was much more reliable. Did he achieve that, and why was that such a driving?
Well, yes. When war started in 1914, there was nothing that could legitimately carry the name of being a production British aero engine at all. We were wholly reliant on imported engines from France, most of which were of the pattern known as the Rotary, in which the crankshaft stays still and the engine whizzes round. Physically, the cylinders go round and round with the propellers strapped on the front of it all. And they served very well in the war, actually, but in mechanical terms, Henry Royce much preferred a derivative of the motor car engine with lots of cylinders and liquid to cool it and so on. And in fact, the Eagle really became the benchmark for reliability for the whole of the world's aviation industry.
And reliability is so important in aviation. It's important in an automobile, but why is reliability so much more important really in aviation or in a wartime situation?
In the Western world in general, and it's true in Great Britain, it's certainly equally true in the United States, after World War I, there was a general feeling for a couple of years that, well, that's the war to end all wars, and airplanes are things for wars. And it took one or two people of vision, like Lord Northcliffe, who owned the Daily Mail newspaper here, to think, we'll put up a prize for the first direct crossing of the Atlantic Ocean, and that happened in 1919. And Alcock and Brown, of course, were the first people to fly directly from America to Europe, using a couple of Eagle engines. Eagle engines were also used for the first flight from England to Australia in the first year. And 3 years later, for the first ever crossing of the South Atlantic. And in fact, the engine that did that is 100 yards from where we are right now speaking, because we're rebuilding it for the Portuguese Navy, who'd made that flight. Coutinho and Cabral were the pilots. But there was a hiatus in aviation in the early 20s, and then the thing began to gather a momentum again in the sort of mid to late 20s, when it was realized that the Royal Air Force or the United States Army Air Force, or whoever it was, needed more modern equipment. And the first of our new generation of engines was the Kestrel engine, of which we have an example right here, Same size as the Eagle internally, 20 litres, but a whole generation more modern in appearance with aluminium castings for the cylinder blocks and crank chamber mated one to the other, and very much looking like the baby Merlin, which was yet to follow.
And that had some fairly significant successes, my understanding is, in some aviation contests or aviation exhibits. Is that correct?
In a way, not absolutely directly, because the Kestrel, which was widely used in the 1930s by the Royal Air Force, 500 or 600 horsepower engine, had a big brother which we designed, 37 litres, nearly twice as big, called the Buzzard. And we were asked in Rolls-Royce if we would do a competitive engine for the Schneider Trophy Seaplane contest in 1929. And Henry Royce, having looked at things like narrow-angle brand-new V16 engines, thought, well, time doesn't permit. The best thing we can do is get the biggest engine we have and hot it up. And we took the Buzzard, which is about 900 horsepower, and in 6 months we turned out the first of the R engine family, which gave 1,900 horsepower for the race in 1929, 2,350 for the event in 1931, which took it in perpetuity for Great Britain, and then it went on to over 2,500 horse to raise the world airspeed record over the 400-mile-an-hour mark a few weeks later. And the technology of that engine was what allowed us to launch as a private venture the engine that became the Merlin just before Henry Royce died in 1933.
Was there interest, was there an understanding or a desire to build the Merlin engine before World War II, look like it was coming up, or was World War II really the pressure? Once people knew there was going to be a war, then it had to be built.
I don't think that the war at that stage had anything to do with it. We had been the leaders on aero engines in Rolls-Royce on the Allied side in the First World War. Other engines that had come along and had been launched too late to really contribute to the victory in the war, in a way eclipsed Rolls-Royce in the 1920s, and it was the determination to get back to the front end of our armed forces in this country, the Royal Air Force and the Naval Aviation side, that really drove the process rather than signs of war, because the Merlin was launched, or the PV-12 that preceded it, in 1932, before Henry Royce's death. But we hadn't got a long way down the line before it got total support from the British government and began to find new homes in the form of the ferry battle bomber and, of course, the Hawker Hurricane and Supermarine Spitfire fighters. And we secured our place in those airplanes by taking on board a third of the launch cost of the prototype airplanes for a start. And it was by about the mid-30s that the threat of war became more evident. And what that did was make Rolls-Royce and our customer, the government, focus on increasing capacity for output and on getting the engine right for what appeared to be the inevitable war ahead.
And then when war came, were you ready?
From the moment Ernest Hives, one of our great heroes of the past, became general manager of the company in 1936, his key focus was on preparing the company for war. Now that was against a background of the government recognizing the need to begin to expand the aviation and armaments industries. And in 1938, of course, our Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, visited Hitler in Germany and came back with his famous piece of paper, got out of the aeroplane and waved it to the crowd at Croydon Airport, shouting, "Peace in our time." Well, if anything, it bought an extra year of time before we formally declared war on Germany as a result of their having invaded Poland, an ally. And in that 1 year, between 38 and 39, enormous differences were made to the situation on output. The Crewe factory, shadow factory built for Rolls-Royce, had come on stream. That's where the motor cars are built today. Derby had really got its act going and done a lot to subcontract mass production of a lot of the components of the Merlin engine. And engines were being turned out in sufficient numbers. Then, of course, from 39 until the summer of 1940, there was what we call the phony war period, when there were some painful things happening over in Europe, and we were losing ferry battles and Hawker Hurricanes. But Britain was left untouched for that year, and again that allowed the industry to really move to a point when the Battle of Britain did start in the middle of 1940. Despite all the losses of Spitfires and Hurricanes during those months of the battle, we finished the battle with some 700 Hurricanes and Spitfires when we'd started it with 600. So that shows how successfully industry had managed to turn the corner and turn things out. As regards the performance of the engine, it was a good 1,000 horsepower engine in the spring of 1940, and we owe it to the Allies, or the long relationship with the United States. Despite their Neutralities Act, they'd somehow or other helped to make sure that 100-octane gas got through to the United Kingdom by way of neutral ports. And by putting 100 octane into the Merlin instead of 87 octane,